just want to say thank you for inviting me to speak here. I found the presentations beforehand very, very valuable. And so what I'm going to do is share my perspectives, and hopefully, we would have a comprehensive overview of AI and machine learning in primary care. So let me go ahead. I've actually spent, I train in internal medicine, primary care, and so I've spent 8 years in public health and primary care. I'm based in Bethesda, Maryland, and then spent, after 8 years in primary care in Maryland, I did spend another 8 years at the National Institutes of Health, where I was focused on health disparities research from translational, basic care, translational, and implementation research, holding various roles, mostly around innovation. And at the launch of the precision medicine and big data, I really got involved to ensure that to make sure that there is a health equity lens to precision medicine and big data. And I had the opportunity after 8 years at the NIH to work at IBM. I was one of the first 5 clinicians that were hired by IBM Watson Health, which was a new business unit, to provide data and scientific evidence. So I served as the lead scientific evidence for data and evidence at IBM Watson Health. So a lot of my presentation today is based on sort of the expert knowledge that I've acquired through the years. This is my disclosure. I do receive compensation for strategic advisory role at Madi Health, which is a health equity AI company, and Huron AI. Madi Health is focused on sickle cell disease, and Huron AI is cancer AI. But what I'm going to present is basically foundationals for primary care. And in terms of my presentation outline, I will touch a little bit on the background, but I want to make sure that I'm focused on primary care and how we're using data science, and especially AI and machine learning, and focus on how to identify sources of bias as well. So I think this would complement the previous presentations that came. But I want to start with 2 takeaway messages from my presentation today, that we as primary care physicians, healthcare practitioners, other allied healthcare professionals in the practice of primary care really have a critical role to play in this AI and data science generation. This is because the data that we generate and the evidence as well lays the foundation for the ethical and responsible use of AI. And the data that we're generating is also we want to make sure that it benefits everyone and not just a few. And the second key message is that we really need to understand the scope and the depth of these sources of biases in these technologies, and make sure that we are really investing in the approaches or efforts to address these biases. I start off with this slide. Basically, we all know that data is transforming every aspect of our lives. And big data especially, we're using data to make decisions in so many ways. In the healthcare space, we know data is being used to allocate resources. It's being used to identify populations that are at risk. and we're using it in our AI and machine learning algorithms. And so it's basically being used in just about every domain of healthcare. And so we need to ensure that in our basic science, in our clinical research, in our implementation science effort, that we're using the right data, we're asking the right research questions, and that because we know that ultimately these data points are going to drive the decisions for us and for our patients. And unfortunately, we do have a lot of missed opportunities with our science, with our evidence, and in the care of our patients. And to me, the very core challenges that we face today does not lie in our, in our care of patients, but it really lies in our science. It lies in how we're building evidence, and how we're translating that evidence into the care of our patients. And so across the continuum from the science generation to the care of our patients, there are data points that are critical that we have not really captured or optimized. And so as a consequence, we see suboptimal patient experiences that have consequences, that have real consequences for patient groups. There are clinical trials that do not have the diverse representation that is needed. And so these missed opportunities have resulted in harm and have resulted in the health disparities that we are trying to address today, that we face today. So I'll tell you why, as primary care physicians or allied health professionals, including public health, why we really need to be at the forefront, because our practice approaches are shifting, right? We're shifting to really meet the needs of our individual patients, and especially those that are living with chronic conditions. A lot of the time, managing our patients, especially those living with chronic conditions, requires not just meeting the clinical needs, but also ensuring that they're living comfortably. We're ensuring that we're addressing patient-centeredness, and also thinking holistically about their social needs, their behavioral needs, and mental well-being as well. And so we now talk in terms of, when there was a one-size-fits-all medicine, now we are transitioning to multidisciplinary teams, or we're transitioning from one-size-fits-all to really precision medicine. And so we're now talking about, predicting and preventing and early detection of disease conditions in our patients, and focusing on screening as primary care physicians. We have transitioned from where the clinicians used to have full autonomy or authority to multidisciplinary teams that are managing the patients and emphasizing personalized care. We also used to have, episodic care. You see a patient in the clinic, you collect the data, but now there's an ability for continuous monitoring of our patients where, they can wear Fitbits, or they will capture their blood pressure or heart rates at home. And also we're prioritizing not just volume of care, but the value of care, the quality of care for our patients. And when we talk about quality, we're looking at safety, we're looking at timeliness, effectiveness, efficiency. We've talked about equity and equitable care for our patients. And finally, we're transitioning from where we had just, we'll randomly allocate resources, but with limited resources and cost of care rising, we're looking at optimizing efficiency, right, of healthcare resources and trying to identify those that really need it so that we can improve the care of all of our patients. So these are largely some of the reasons why we need to leverage technologies to help and capture those data points that are needed to ensure that we're delivering, real evidence-based patient care for our patients, delivering tailored, culturally competent interventions so that we are aligned with this era of precision medicine. I know the previous speakers, Yoon and Mark, touched on AI and machine learning, but I do want to go into a little bit more depth and present sort of, because I think that would help to understand the scope and context of what I would like to discuss. And so we heard from Yoon that an artificial intelligence system is a system that can make predictions, that can make recommendations or decisions that influence our physical or virtual environments. And so they're typically trained on large amounts of structured or unstructured data, and they may be designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy. So whether full autonomy or with the help of physicians to achieve a desired objective. And machine learning is a subdomain of artificial intelligence. And it refers to this family of algorithms that can identify the patterns in the data. And so machine learning can make predictions or risk or recommendations based on huge data and the patterns that are observed. And there's also deep learning, as you see, that's a subset of machine learning. There's also natural language processing and natural language understanding. That's all part of AI. And some of you may have heard, but I did want to mention it because natural language processing is a subset that deals with machine comprehension. And it also is defined by how machines can understand human language and behavior. And so this is sort of what I wanted to present. And then we've talked about generative AI that can generate large volumes of texts and codes and images, video and music. And so they are a type of generative AI or large language models that is trained on text and product content from large amounts of text. And so ChatGPT, for example, is one of that. And so we have EHR and medical records that we can are used. So let me illustrate also the spectrum of data, big data, AI, and advanced analytics. I know there's a lot on the screen, but I wanted to just emphasize the fact that the spectrum of advanced analytic applications from which machine learning and deep learning are generated range from just having advanced analytics or statistics, which is less complex, to our advanced analytics model, which involves AI and machine learning, or they deal with sort of the complex analysis. And so think about AI and machine learning as an extension of our traditional statistical analysis or computational models. And so whereas our traditional statistical measures deals with a change in X is associated with a change in Y, these, as you get more complex, it basically provides insights into a change in X is not only associated with a change in Y, but the actual magnitude of that change and the timing of that change. So it gives you more scope. And so these are some of the steps. This is another way of looking at it and actually showing you the different mixed methods research approaches, okay? So it's a various types of questions, research or health questions, that are used to prompt different types of advanced analytics. And so it ranges from descriptive analytics, right, to that informs questions around what has happened to similar patients, and then you describe the patterns, the trends, the associations. There is similarity analytics that informs questions about what has happened to similar patients, or to identify best or promising interventions. And then you have predictive analytics, what will happen, where you use different, in questions, forecasting, predictive model, hypothesis testing, to questions around what should happen, which is forecasting or prescriptive analytics. So sort of a spectrum, and the questions that are, basically what I'm showing you is, research questions that would prompt these different types of methods to be used. And what I try to advocate along the spectrum is that we need to ensure that we're integrating, the key variables: culture, environment, neighborhood characteristics. You would also see that ideally, if you want to, descriptive analytics relies heavily on retrospective data, but prospective data is what is really valuable or used for these predictive analytics, right? A lot of the time we're using, our evidence, but for this it relies heavily on prospective data to make it more, meaningful and generate additional insights. And so again, these advanced analytics are increasingly dynamic. They leverage the dynamic interplay of the interactions and observations of health over time. A lot of the times we know that we can improve the accuracy of this data or insights from, really how we're pulling the data together and how we're communicating and how we're actually integrating social factors, as I mentioned. But generally, this is what is the sort of the spectrum and how we're applying it with our real-time data sets. And I want to share this with you because I know this is a mostly research team, and think about your role as you're working with AI and machine learning developers. I'm going to use the next 3 slides to illustrate some of the AI and machine learning approaches for answering research or clinical trials, clinical questions. So this figure, for example, illustrates the study setup for a retrospective prediction task using longitudinal patient data. And so this is an example of a question: what is my patient's risk of developing a condition X? And it can be approached by a combination of feature engineering and selection methods to extract those salient or important features from real-world evidence data. But there is also predictive modeling that maybe does not focus on a single global model that has trained, but you can also look at patient-specific local models. There's also personalized predictive modeling and multitask learning methods that all can simultaneously predict multiple risks and leverage the risk across the continuum of risk information and associations. So I just wanted to illustrate sort of what happens or some of the research methods that are used. And so on the right, you see sort of the setup for the prediction, right? And so the diagnosis window can be the time when the patient was diagnosed with the disease, and then the prediction window defines how much time before the disease was diagnosed. And so it could be 6 months or a year. And then only data from this window is extracted using longitudinal patient data. And then the data is typically aggregated when they apply these feature engineering methods. And then you'll see sort of this visual or matrix representation for downstream modeling. This is sort of just an illustration. You can also ask about you may be considering sort of a care journey or a pathway for a patient that has chronic conditions. And so I may be asking, what is happening to patients that are similar to my patients who is sociodemographically complex and has multiple chronic conditions. And so the figure on the right is showing the sort of the visualization of the disease progression model based on an EHR data. And then you see the different states of the disease, the duration of each state, and then the various observation. And so we use this, for example, in to identify the pathway for patients who had type 2 diabetes that had other chronic conditions. Think about it. I mean, there are several classes of diabetes drugs that have been approved by the FDA. There are over 7,000 clinical trials for diabetes that have been registered around the world. And we know that these drugs must really show meaningful reduction in glycemic control and parameters, making sure that there's, renal, cardiovascular safety. And so a question, for example, which drugs have been used and what is the likely outcome in which patients achieved glycemic control, and you can use sort of this pathway to look at different patients and how they did on these features. So, I mean, the bottom line is there is a lot of potential that AI and machine learning and looking at these treatment pathways can do and help to augment or add to a decision making. And so the collective goal basically is to make sure that we truly personalize, medicine, especially for patients who have chronic conditions, who may not necessarily have been in clinical trials that we know are always very, the condition, the environment is different in a clinical trial than what's in real world evidence. And so this sort of helps with that. And then the third question is, you can ask a research question, what are my patients' top risk factors so that you can intervene? And think about an example of looking at cardiovascular disease risk in a patient. And there are various types of risk factors, such as family history of premature heart disease, metabolic syndrome, chronic kidney disease. And depending on age, there are other factors. And so you may need technology or AI to help fine-tune risk scores so that you can identify, which medications or interventions are used. And this is just showing a chart of predictive risk and then different clinical parameters for patients to help with that. So with AI and machine learning, we are really able to answer a lot of questions. For example, how do you optimize care for different patient groups? What are some of the triggers for disease onset? What interventions will help you to promote equitable outcomes for patients? And so I think there's so much potential, especially with our data. And, I think just wanted briefly to talk about some of the current uses of AI in healthcare. We know, for example, in preclinical and translational research and drug discovery, during the COVID, there was a lot of AI being used in population health, GIS mapping, for example. But these are some of the uses in primary care, for remote monitoring, for example, tracking vital signs. With some of the work that I do with Madi Health, we are providing care management for patients with sickle cell disease who are at risk for vaso-occlusive crisis. And so this requires ensuring that we're monitoring them in their home, right, with the patient app. And then we can track whether they're hydrating, whether they have, stressful events that may trigger a crisis, because the goal is to prevent them from getting into the ED and then being admitted and having that sort of cycle of chronic pain. Predictive modeling, I mentioned, population health management. We've done a lot. There's a lot around health equity dashboards where you can identify or put in disparity-sensitive measures and display sort of what the performance indicators, how your patient population is doing, and then healthcare management processes as well to streamline the care flow. And so there are various uses of AI and machine learning in primary care. So let me pivot now and talk about AI bias and how we can identify the sources of bias. And I'll speak more from what I call sort of the 60,000 feet. So AI bias is basically a general concept and refers to the fact that an AI system has been designed in a way, whether intentional or unintentional, that may make the system's decision use unfair. And I think we heard from Mark in some of the challenges in implementation and looking for some of the bias. So we often talk about bias that's in the algorithm of the AI system and in the data that's used to train it. But bias can also emerge from a result of cultural, social, or institutional expectation, because the technical limitations of a design does not, it's mostly quantitative, and so a lot of the time we may be missing the qualitative aspect. So there's a lot of papers that have been written on AI bias. This is sort of especially in developing the machine learning pipeline. This is one that was written, and a graphic that illustrates some of the categories. So formulating the research problem, ensuring that you're integrating, ensuring that there's no racial, ethnic bias or gender bias, to the data collection we heard about earlier, processing the data, how we developing the model and validating, and then implementing the model. So this is sort of one of the ways. But I do want to focus on, stepping back from AI bias, especially in the algorithmic bias, what I call the 5 broad aspects of bias across generating data and evidence, especially if we want to address health equity. And the 5 sources of bias I call the evidence bias, the research evidence bias, the experience or expertise of the provider or healthcare or physician, clinicians, exclusion bias, which is the 3rd one, and that includes data and missingness. But I'm going to talk about all 5 of this because I think it's important. And I mentioned earlier, with research evidence, the challenge that we face today is actually in our science and in our evidence base and how we translate the evidence into care. So we have a research evidence bias, I believe, from our research translation, because our clinical decision making is usually informed by a synthesis of evidence that's tied to clinical trials, rigorous scientific randomized controlled trials, and very little on real-world evidence studies. But what really makes up the evidence for decision making? Who defines what the evidence is? And because a lot of the times the recommendations that we're making is because of how our science is funded, how our science is reviewed, either at the National Institutes of Health or elsewhere. We need to address lack of inclusion in clinical trials, researcher diversity, and all that. And so there's huge biases that we need to think about and address, and especially in primary care. And otherwise, we are at risk of feeding these research biases into our AI and machine learning tools, which rely on that research evidence, which relies on clinical trials and real-world evidence data. The second is the experience or expertise. And I think this is the huge elephant in the room. We talk a lot about conscious or unconscious biases. I hear about, what as physicians or nurses, or, what we write in our EHR basically gets translated it's coded into our AI and machine learning, right? And so we need to think about that. We need to address those pre-existing stereotypes, those discriminatory practices that we have against different patients. I think the values of our primary care is compassion towards our patient and listening and ensuring that we're coming up with the right diagnosis, and providing access and quality to all patients. But I think, so our actions need to be influenced by that and translated into our EHR as well. The third aspect I think we talked about, and we heard from Yoon and Mark about, embedded data, but the biases in it. We talked about missing data or incomplete data in EHRs. We know some of our patients who are socially disadvantaged may not have access to the healthcare system to even get their data that's needed into our EHRs. And so thinking about those data biases as well is important. The fourth aspect is the environment. And there's a lot of talk around social determinants of health. And most of our current, so the lack of integrating social measures into our AI may perpetuate those biases, and we need to also think about how we can incorporate that into those feature variables. But let me talk about some of our current research practices that I always want to emphasize about our data, how we re-inform norms around norms of homogeneity, right? So we talk about our Black populations, we talk about our Hispanic communities, indigenous communities, or communities of color, and we know that when we apply predictive models and to generalize populations, we also perpetuate in bias, because we are, there are several, each population group may have different features or different risk attributes that may contribute to their risk or their health outcomes. And so thinking about how we're generalizing and not including other data, including the life course of patient values and preferences, all can add up to that missingness, or data invincibility is what is sometimes called. And so developing sort of standards, or AI fairness standards, and selecting appropriate reference groups, and not really looking just at race, ethnicity, making good definitions of patient cohorts are also really critical to this. And then the final E is promoting data empathy and really understanding those experiences and context of the people. Ensuring that we're integrating patients' needs and values, as I mentioned earlier, their life course experience, and the determinants of health. For some, it will include their neighborhood characteristics. For some, it would include geography or racism and discrimination that they may have experienced, or other stresses. So those are the 5, and I do want to take time to really stress on those 2 key messages that I had mentioned in the beginning. We know that AI and machine learning present unique challenges for us, right? It holds tremendous potential, but there's also dangerous consequences if we don't use it right. We are about to experience a major transformation in medicine, and the transformation can be a good path, or it can be a dangerous one if we don't define it well. So it all depends on how we define its course, and it starts with us in primary care. We have an opportunity to help address these health inequities, and leverage data and big data and AI to make sure that we're making better predictions about our disease. We're making better risk stratification. We are advancing personalized or patient-centered care. There is a lot of promised opportunity, in my opinion, and I'm optimistic, but I think that we need to realize that primary care is foundational. And we need to set the standards and be ahead in this effort. I don't think we should be bystanders. We need a forward-looking framework, and one that demands an agenda that's responsible use, along with creative new approaches, and making sure that we're developing the guardrails for AI. And I think at the very least, we all agree, for example, that we need data privacy protections. We all agree that we should be notified at a minimum, or our patients, if AI is being used. We should agree that AI should protect from all forms of discrimination, and that we should also agree that we should set the standards for AI and not let others set those standards for us, especially in primary care. And so using AI to advance our core primary values requires a new course or a better course, and definitely need to make us primary care be the leaders in this effort as well. And so I think it's up to us, it's up to all of us, the people in this room, to make sure that the AI architecture is set up for equity, is set up for inclusivity, patient-centeredness, and the value-driven innovation that we really need. So I think that's it. I just wanted to end up about humanity and empathy, and mention that in healthcare, empathy really is a reflection of our compassion, and how we use AI and machine learning really to enhance human lives really will depend on our compassion and being at the center, human in the loop, as we call it. And so we need to make sure that, high tech is only part of the solution, and AI and machine learning should really function at the service of humanity. So thank you for listening.